continent. My name is Angie Meher, and as usual, I'll be joining you for Tuesday's episode. And we begin straight away with a look at some of the news making the headlines from Africa. We start in Libya, where border guards rescued around 100 men and women from an uninhabited zone near Salt Lake along the Libyan-Tunisia border. In the distant shimmering heat haze, 6 people were the latest to reach the area from Tunisia. We have more details in this report.
Libyan border guards said that over the past 2 weeks they have rescued hundreds of migrants who said they were left by Tunisian authorities in the border region near Al-Assa, about 150 kilometers west of Tripoli. In early July, hundreds of migrants from sub-Saharan African countries were driven out of the Tunisian port city of Sfax as racial tensions flared following the death of a Tunisian man in a clash between locals and migrants. One of the migrants from Sudan said he worked for a year in Tunisia's construction sector after reaching the country clandestinely through Niger and Algeria. At its closest point near Sfax, Tunisia is only about 130 kilometers from the Italian island of Lampedusa. The North African country is a major gateway for migrants and asylum seekers attempting perilous sea voyages in hopes of a better future in Europe, whose leaders have offered financial aid to help Tunisia manage the flow. Human Rights Watch said up to 1,200 black Africans were expelled or forcibly transferred by Tunisian security forces in July to the country's desert border region with Libya and Algeria. In mid-July, the Tunisian Red Crescent said it had provided shelter to at least 630 migrants who had been taken after July 3 to Ras Jadir, about 40 kilometers north of the Al-Assa. A few days later, though, hundreds of migrants are still stuck in the Ras Jadir buffer zone. They said they had been forced there by Tunisian security forces.
Still with our news, bursts of gunfire were heard early Tuesday in the center of Burkina Faso's capital near an airbase. The shots were heard from around 1:45 in the heart of the city in the morning before ceasing about 40 minutes later. More details to follow.
In Burkina Faso, gunfire was heard in the capital Ouagadougou on Tuesday. The incident comes 10 months after a coup, the second in less than a year in the West African country plagued by violence. It also comes less than a week after the military seized power in neighboring Niger after throwing democratically elected President Mohamed Bazoum. Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power in Burkina Faso in a September 30, 2022 coup that ousted Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who in January that year had toppled the country's last elected president, Roch-Marc Christian Kaboré. The motive for both coups was reportedly anger at failures to stem an insurgency that has claimed thousands of lives since spilling over from the neighboring Mali in 2015. But each of them has hit the country's ability to fight effectively against the insurgents. Some 40% of Burkina Faso has since been seized by insurgents. More than 16,000 civilians, troops and police have died in the increased attacks, according to an NGO count, including more than 5,000 since the start of this year. More than 2 million people have also been displaced within the country, making it one of the worst internal displacement crises in Africa.
Still continuing with our news, and this time to Niger, where France will begin evacuating French as well as European citizens from the country starting on Tuesday, according to its foreign ministry, days after a junta seized power in the West African country. The overthrow last Wednesday of the president, the 7th military takeover in less than 3 years, has sent shockwaves across the region, pitting Niger's former Western allies against the likes of Russia and other junta leaders in the region. We have more details.
Niger's former colonial power France has had troops in the region for a decade, but some locals say they want the former colonial ruler to stop intervening in their affairs. On Sunday, supporters of the junta burned French flags and attacked the French embassy in Niger's capital Niamey, prompting police to fire volleys of tear gas in response. The foreign ministry said in a statement that, considering the situation in Niamey, the violence against the embassy the day before yesterday, and the fact that their airspace is shut and the citizens cannot leave by their own means, France is preparing the evacuation of its citizens and other European citizens who want to leave the country. The statement said the evacuation will start today. French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna said late Monday that the protest in front of the embassy and the ensuing accusations that France shot at the crowd, which it denies, have all the usual ingredients of destabilization, the Russian African way. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, last week welcomed the coup in Niger and said his forces were available to restore order. The Kremlin said on Monday that the situation in Niger was cause for serious concern and called for a swift return to constitutional order. According to the French Foreign Ministry website, there were just under 1,200 French nationals in Niger in 2022. The coup has raised fears for the security of the Sahel region. Niger is the world's 7th biggest producer of uranium, the radioactive metal widely used for nuclear energy and treating cancer. Regional bloc ECOWAS has imposed sanctions, including a halt in all financial transactions and a national assets freeze, and said it could authorize force to reinstate Bazoum, who is still locked in his palace. But the juntas of neighboring Burkina Faso, Mali and Guinea all voiced their support for the coup's leaders on Monday.
We're the final news item and our topic for today. The Foreign Secretary James Cleverly of the U.S. is visiting 3 African countries in a 4-day visit across the continent. The visit aims at announcing new investments for small businesses in Ghana, one of the biggest export markets in sub-Saharan Africa. Ghana, Nigeria and Zambia are the 3 countries included in the visit. In Ghana, the British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly is pledging a £40 million boost for the country's businesses. We're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by our guest for this afternoon, His Excellency Ambassador Gamal Bayoumi, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for joining us, sir. And let me start by asking you, how do you describe, this new push to further ties between African countries and the United Kingdom?
There is a sort of interest more and more in Africa nowadays, thanks to the performance of Africa in the late years, especially when they perform at the level of the leadership. And their meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, their meeting with Europe,
yes,
also several times. So also the initiative of our President of Egypt to call on the donor countries to come and invest in Africa with the Egyptian experience. So we had positive reaction from Japan when our President was president of the conference of the PCAD, which is the Japan-Africa conference.
Yes.
With Europe also, when Europe make a conference in Sharm el-Sheikh with the African countries, and with China, which gave a positive reaction. So I think England, it is the oldest occupying force in Africa, with France, with Italy, with Germany. All of them, I think they feel responsible to come back to Africa and try to help it. Africa is really the poorest continent in the whole world, and it deserves much better treatment than it receives right away.
Absolutely.
So I hope this will continue. I hope that the awareness of the national community and the regional one and the bilateral also will be raised and will be in favor for even the donor, because the opportunities of investment and trade with Africa is becoming much better than before.
Absolutely. Now, we've also seen, the coronavirus pandemic, as well as other, European crises affecting the situation in Europe, as well as affecting European-African ties on a larger scale. How do you see this as, an interruption to some of the possibilities of ties between Africa and Europe?
We witnessed in the last few years 2 disastrous internet and disaster problems. First, it was the corona epidemic, and thank God that in Egypt we were able to face it. The second is the war in Ukraine and its effect on the supply of food and the supply of energy.
Yes.
And thank God here Egypt could face both of them, because we were ahead by our economic reform, which started in 2016, and it made us face all these problems while we were standing in a good position. So as a matter of fact, we have enough experience to exchange it with our friends and brothers, either in Africa or the Arab world or anywhere else. Egypt, thank God, is much better, in a much better condition and situation if you compare it with any other country in the world.
Absolutely. Mr. Ambassador, how do you explain, that sub-Saharan Africa is also grabbing the attention of investors that come to the continent?
It is very difficult to realize because the problems are a little bit complicated. From one side, that an investor, when he is trying to choose where to invest his money, it's much easier for him to invest in the developing countries.
Yes.
The developed countries.
Right.
In few hours, he can go to the money exchange or to wherever, and in few hours, he can make profits. Here we have some challenges in Africa. Bureaucracy is very slow. Our banking system needs much more development. Transport in Africa is not that easy, and. So it needs the effort of us first as Africans to make the life of an investor much easier and much better. And on the other side, we can call on our partners on the international level to come and invest with us. And I think that such a visit now, it's marking a sort of interest coming better and better gradually.
Absolutely. Mr. Ambassador, now, why do you say, in your opinion, that some, or the majority rather, of the foreign investments to Africa have been directed to small and medium-sized enterprises?
We need a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, because as a matter of fact, although we are one united organization, the African Union, but we don't know the details about each other's conditions and economies. I hope that immediately we have to make a lot of conferences, technical ones, to make all the parts of the continent aware of what is happening in the other side, so we can market for it. We can call for investors, whether local investors from within Africa itself, or from Europe, or the America, or China, or Japan. And this needs really a lot of concentration. And I think we are on the right road, but I hope that we can act much more quickly in this concern.
Absolutely. Finally, Mr. Ambassador, now as a source of imports, the European Union accounts for about 26% of all imports, in terms of value into African countries, followed by China at 16%. And this is according to the latest data. How do you see these numbers, Mr. Ambassador?
It is good, but if you dig in the details, it's not good enough. Because most of what the developed countries are importing from Africa is raw material. They do not encourage Africa to produce something of industry or develop its agricultural ability to export. So the figure is good, but the details need to visit and thoroughly study in order to make our position much better than it is now.
Absolutely right. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Gamal Bayoumi, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and your insight. That's all the time for today's edition of Africa Today. I'm Angie Meher. Thank you for watching.